Classics for Young Readers, Volume 4B, page 153. Dangerous Adventure, Lindbergh's Famous Flight, by Ruth Bellof Gross. Charles Lindbergh grew up on a farm in Minnesota. One of the things he loved best was to lie in the tall grass and look up at the sky. Charles wished he had wings. How wonderful it would be to fly, Charles thought. When Charles was 10, his mother took him to an air show. Charles had never seen an airplane before. Most people had never seen an airplane. Airplanes were something new. The first airplanes couldn't fly very fast. They couldn't go very far or very high. And they were only big enough for one or two people. The propeller was in back. The pilot sat outside in the front. Mrs. Lindbergh told Charles that airplanes were dangerous. She didn't want him to go up in an airplane, ever. "Suppose the engine stopped," she said. "Suppose a wing fell off. He could be killed." But Charles kept thinking about flying. He imagined he had wings and could fly through the air, over fences, over the tops of trees, over the roof of his house. 11 years later, Charles Lindbergh had his own plane and was really flying. He was 21 years old. Airplanes were still new and strange to most people. When a plane flew over a house or barn, everyone would run outside to look at it. When a plane landed in a cow field, the farmers would come right up close, and so would the cows. Pilots earned money by taking people up for rides in their planes. A pilot would stay in one town for a few days, sell as many rides as he could, and then go to another town. This was called barnstorming. At first, Charles barnstormed with another pilot. Just before they landed in a new town, Charles would walk out on the wing of the plane while it was still flying. Sometimes he jumped off the wing with a parachute. The pilot got more customers when Charles did tricks like this. Soon the newspapers were writing about Charles. They called him Daredevil Lindbergh. His friends, though, called him Slim. Later, Slim barnstormed by himself. He did all kinds of tricks with his plane, spins and loops and rolls. Barnstorming was a good way to earn money in the summer, but nobody wanted to pay for a plane ride when it was cold and snowy. Lindbergh needed a job he could do all year round. When he was 24 years old, he got a job flying bags of mail from one city to another. It was easy to fly the mail in the daytime. At night, though, flying could be dangerous. Pilots couldn't always see where they were going or where they were landing. On two different nights, Lindbergh had to jump out of his plane with a parachute. Once he landed in a cornfield. Once he landed on top of a barbed wire fence. Both times the planes were wrecked, but the bags of mail were still in good shape. Lindbergh got the mail out of the wreckage and sent it on by train. One night in September 1926, Lindbergh was flying the mail from St. Louis, Missouri to Chicago, Illinois. It was a beautiful, clear night. Lindbergh wished he could keep on flying and never stop. What would he need to keep on flying for a really long time? The plane he was flying now couldn't go more than 3 or 4 hours without running out of gas. He needed a plane with gas tanks that could hold a lot of gas, and he needed a much better engine, an engine that could keep going for hours and hours. If he had the right kind of plane, he could fly all night or longer. He could even fly from New York City to Paris, France. Paris was on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, about 3,600 miles from New York. When Lindbergh carried the mail, he only had to fly 285 miles. Lindbergh had heard about a prize, $25,000 for the first person who could fly between New York and Paris without stopping. He could be that person. Why not? He would fly alone. It might take him from one morning to the next night, but he could stay awake that long. By the time Lindbergh landed in Chicago, he had made up his mind. He would try for the prize. First, he had to get a plane. Lindbergh had $2,000 saved up, but he couldn't buy a plane for $2,000. He was living in St. Louis then. Some businessmen in St. Louis knew what a good pilot Lindbergh was. The men wanted him to be the first pilot to fly nonstop from New York to Paris, so they got together and said they would give Lindbergh the rest of the money for the plane. Lindbergh knew just what kind of plane he wanted, a monoplane with one engine, but the people who made the airplanes would not sell him that kind of plane. They did not think he could get to Paris alive. What? They said. You want to fly alone in a plane with only one engine? The plane would crash, they said. Then everybody would think their planes were no good. Charles Lindbergh had to find a plane soon. It was winter time now, and he knew that some pilots were making plans to fly to Paris in the spring. He wanted to get there before they did. The others already had their planes, big, heavy planes that could hold as many as 4 people. At the end of February, Lindbergh took the train to California. He was hoping that a small company would agree to make a plane for him, and they did. They said they would make exactly the kind of plane Lindbergh wanted. Every single day for 2 months, Lindbergh and the plane people worked on the plane. Sometimes they worked all night. By the end of April, the plane was finished. It was shiny. It was a shiny silver plane, the most beautiful plane Lindbergh had ever seen. Lindbergh gave his plane a name, Spirit of St. Louis. That was his way of thanking the men in St. Louis who had paid for the plane. Now Lindbergh really had to hurry. At least 3 other planes were almost ready to fly across the Atlantic. What if one of those planes started out before he could even get to New York? Lindbergh left California on May 10, 1927. First, he flew the Spirit of St. Louis to St. Louis. He made the overnight trip in 14 hours and 25 minutes and set a record. The next morning, May 12th, he took off from St. Louis. He landed in New York at Curtis Field 7 hours and 20 minutes later. Another record. Newspaper reporters and photographers were waiting for Lindbergh when he landed. Soon everybody was talking about him. The newspapers called him the Flying Fool. He hated the name, and he didn't like the crowds that followed him wherever he went. He wished he could be alone in his plane flying over the Atlantic Ocean. But there was more work to be done on the plane, and the weather was bad. Rain in New York and storms over the ocean. By May 19th, Lindbergh had been at the airfield for a week. He was fed up. Lindbergh's friends tried to make him feel better. "Let's go to a play," one of them said. But they never got to the play. On the way, they called the Weather Bureau. Good news! There was a sudden change in the weather. Maybe Lindbergh could leave in the morning. Lindbergh rushed back to the airfield. He knew that 2 other planes would be getting ready to take off for Paris. But the airfield was quiet. What were the other pilots waiting for? Good weather all the way to Paris? Lindbergh wasn't going to wait. He would start for Paris in the morning. As an airmail pilot, he had learned to start out and then turn back if he had to. He got to bed around midnight. He couldn't sleep. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Lindbergh was at the airfield again. It was still raining. He knew he couldn't take off from Curtis Field. He would need a longer runway when the plane was carrying a full load of gasoline. So, in rainy darkness, a truck dragged the Spirit of St. Louis to Roosevelt Field, about a mile away. Two men poured gas into the tanks, 5 gallons at a time. At last, the tanks held 450 gallons, almost a ton and a half of gas. The pilots and crews of the other planes were there to say goodbye. No one knew if they would ever see Charles Lindbergh again. It was after 7 o'clock in the morning when Lindbergh climbed into the cockpit. The runway was muddy. Could he go fast enough in the mud to take off? Was the plane too heavy? Lindbergh had never taken it up with a full load of gas. He started the engine. What was the matter with the engine? It was turning over too slowly. Maybe the weather was slowing it down. Maybe he shouldn't try to take off today. He had to decide now. He buckled the safety belt and pulled his goggles over his eyes. He nodded to two men near the plane. "Let's try it," he said. The two men pulled the blocks out from under the wheels, and the Spirit of St. Louis moved slowly down the muddy runway. Halfway down the runway, the plane made a little hop into the air. It was not moving fast enough to fly. A moment later, it bounced back to the ground. Another hop, then another. The plane was going faster. Lindbergh was near the end of the runway now. One last try. This time, the plane climbed a few feet into the air. Lindbergh just barely missed a tractor standing beyond the runway. The plane climbed higher. Now Lindbergh was above the telephone wires. He was on his way to Paris. For the next day and a half, Lindbergh would be sitting right where he was now. He couldn't lie down and he couldn't stand up. The cockpit was so small he could touch both sides with his elbows. His head was less than an inch from the roof. The whole plane was not even as long as a bus. It had a window on each side and one on top. It did not have a window in front. When Lindbergh wanted to see what was in front of him, he had to use a homemade periscope. There was no toilet on the plane, but there was a metal can with a lid. Lindbergh had a bottle of water to drink and 5 sandwiches to eat on the way. 2 ham sandwiches, 2 beef sandwiches, and a hard-boiled egg sandwich. "Are you only taking 5 sandwiches?" a friend asked him. "Well, I won't need more sandwiches if I get to Paris," Lindbergh answered. "And if I don't get to Paris, I won't need any more either." Besides, Lindbergh could get to Paris if he ran out of food. He knew he'd better get there if he ran out of gas. He knew he'd never get there if he ran out of gas. He wanted to have plenty of gas. Gas was heavy. Every gallon weighed 6 pounds, so everything else on the plane had to be light. Lindbergh cut holes in his maps and charts so they would be lighter. He tore empty pages out of his notebook. He wasn't taking any extra clothes to wear in Paris. He did not even take a toothbrush. He weighed every single thing he took with him. He took a rubber life raft in case he had to land at sea, but he didn't take a parachute because a parachute weighed 20 pounds. He had 2 small pocket flashlights instead of regular lights in the cockpit. Lindbergh did not even have a radio. How could he be sure he was heading the right way? He had a compass. And before he left, he figured out his course and marked it on a chart. He would find Paris by following the chart. By lunchtime, Lindbergh began getting tired and sleepy. The sun was shining into the cockpit, and he felt hot. His legs were stiff. He had a drink of water, but he didn't feel like eating anything. He just wanted to go to sleep. There were dark clouds ahead, storm clouds. "Stay awake," he said to himself. "Stay awake." The clouds grew bigger and darker. Rain poured down, lightning flashed. Lindbergh bumped up, down, and sideways in the cockpit. He was sorry he didn't have a parachute. Soon the storm was over, but not for long. There were more clouds ahead. Lindbergh flew above the clouds, below the clouds, and between the clouds. Sometimes he had to fly right through the clouds, and sometimes he had to fly through fog, blinding white fog. He got sleepier and more tired. He stamped his feet. He sang a song out loud, very loud. Lindbergh had been flying for 13 hours. It was dark now. The plane was shaking and bumping again, and the air was cold. Lindbergh zipped up his flying suit and put on his leather mittens and wool-lined helmet. He pulled his flashlight from his pocket and let the light shine on the wings. Ice. Ice on the wings. He could crash in this icy storm. He thought of turning back. Lindbergh's eyes kept closing. He had to hold them open with his fingers. He'd been flying for 27 hours now. Suddenly he saw a speck on the water. It was a boat. No, it was more than one boat. Those specks were fishing boats. Fishing boats couldn't be far from land. Was he near Ireland? Lindbergh was wide awake now. He flew lower, close to the boats. A man stuck up his head out of a porthole and looked up at him. "Which way is Ireland?" Lindbergh yelled. The man didn't move. Lindbergh thought the man was too surprised or too scared to answer. Lindbergh flew on. In less than an hour he was over the rocky tip of Ireland. He saw green fields, roads, wagons, a little village. People ran into the streets and waved up at him. In the late afternoon Lindbergh flew over the coast of England. He came to France just as it was getting dark. He had not eaten for almost 2 days. Now he ate one sandwich and drank some water, and then he was flying over Paris airport. He saw thousands of lights shining below him. They were the lights of automobiles. Thousands of people had come to welcome him and to light his way. Charles Lindbergh landed in Paris on the night of May 21st, 1927. He had been flying alone for 33.5 hours. He had flown from New York to Paris without stopping, something no one had ever done before.